Focus on Aging Adults is sponsored in part by AARP.
Pennsylvania has one of the largest aging populations in the country. Our aging adults are vibrant, active contributors to our society. PCN, in partnership with AARP, present Focus on Aging Adults.
Welcome to Focus on Aging Adults. I'm Larry Casper. This program is brought to you in partnership between PCN and the AARP of Pennsylvania. Today we're talking about family caregiving. Our guests are Clay Jacobs, Director of the Alzheimer's Association of Greater Pennsylvania, Roy Afflerbach, Founder and President of the Afflerbach Group, and Nora Dowd, Eisenhower, Volunteer State President of the AARP of Pennsylvania. Nora, we're going to start with you. When older Pennsylvanians need help with their day-to-day life, often family steps up first. So try to describe the typical scenario.
Good morning, Larry, and thank you for that introduction. While there is a typical scenario, the most common thing we see is that older people want to age in their communities, in their homes, with family and friends. Family is the first line of helping older adults make that happen. We know that there are over 1 million caregivers in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure that that number is much higher. I hear from people every day who are confronting the reality of what do I do to help my loved ones stay home. So it's an issue that we know many people, the longer people are living, that longevity bonus has a cost. And often we see it initially picked up by family members, and it's a heavy burden.
And often physical and cognitive challenges complicate the situation.
Absolutely. And I think when we think of that, 1 in 4 caregivers in Pennsylvania is caring for a loved one with a cognitive concern. And that brings a whole other suite of issues, which may be things that you hadn't expected or things that are progressive and change throughout time. And how do we navigate that from finances to day-to-day living to support services, all of those things. And so we may have our plan and we may have those caregiving issues, but then also when cognitive concerns come in, how does that change and how do we need to adapt along the way, I think is one of those subsets that's a very important and unfortunately has a tremendous impact here in Pennsylvania.
Well, and of course, we also really don't know exactly when that cognitive concern is going to occur. Sometimes it's masked, sometimes it isn't masked, but people think that it's occurring because the individual loses sight or they lose hearing or they lose balance, and people seem to think, well, maybe there's something going on mentally as well, when in many cases that just isn't so. And I know from firsthand because, as you know, Larry, I cared for my mother for 25 years. Fortunately, it was relatively easy for me because her needs were basically related to physical needs. It was only toward the very end that she began to have some cognitive problems. So, but even at that, earlier on, I thought she was having cognitive problems because she began to have macular degeneration, so she could no longer read any longer. She began to be extremely hard of hearing, and therefore it was difficult to communicate with her. And I wasn't quite sure whether it was because she wasn't understanding until we discovered what the issues were. And then that made a world of difference. But again, there was only so much we could do, especially with macular degeneration and so forth. So it's tough. It's tough to figure it out. And then once you figure it out,
were you and your mom under the same roof?
Oh, yes. I brought my parents back from Florida where they had retired to in 1995. My dad passed away in 2001. He had some issues as well, but Mother was pretty much able to care for him. But from that point on then, yes, I took Mother with me wherever I moved to from that point.
And the reason I ask about that, everybody, is that obviously logistics are involved here. So what kind of distance is typically between the family and the person they want to care for? How often do they live under the same roof as Roy just described?
We know that many people live in other states. Roy mentioned Florida. We know people in the early retirement years or young older people might move to another state where it's warmer. But often they return when they need care. Often they return for grandchildren. Often they return to be part of that family unit that they miss, or loved ones or friends or neighbors. But we do know that caring for someone in your home, while it's demanding, it can be a crisis situation unexpectedly. It is easier than the long-distance caregiving that we see so much of today.
And when you're able-bodied and your cognition is good, it's easy to take these activities for granted. So try to just educate our viewers on the things that they don't think about every day, but suddenly they're of vital importance when they're dealing with an aging parent.
Well, just beginning and get up in the morning, obviously getting dressed is an issue, but beyond that, it's how do you get your cup of coffee? Can I really trust myself to be able to use that stove, whether it's electric or gas, doesn't make any difference really. Can I really trust myself to use that, or do I have to do it in a microwave? And if I have to do it in a microwave, I certainly can't use one that's up above the stove because maybe I can't reach that high, I can't see well enough to be safe getting the cup in and out. So you get another smaller microwave and you put it down on the counter where it's easy to operate, and then you put little fuzzy things on the buttons so they know which button to push. And as long as the cognition
is that
there,
right? I hadn't heard.
sounds-
See, this is the kind of insight I'm very interested in, Roy. Go ahead, tell us more.
Yeah, and as long as the cognition is there, that works fine because they can remember, okay, the first to the left, the second on the right, whatever it might be, to be able to do those buttons. Same thing is true with just basic meals. Now, fortunately, in the grocery stores today, you can buy readily prepared meals that are easily warmed in a microwave.
Right.
So that works well also, but the nutrition isn't always the best. And so there's some difficulties that one has to overcome with that. But the biggest difficulty is the fear of leaving that individual alone for an extended period of time. And of course, in my line of work, there were many days I had to be out overnight. So I always had to make sure I had a caregiver that could at least stop in, make sure everything was all right. I always had at least 2 cell phones available in different rooms so that if mother became sort of stranded in one room or the other, she'd still be able to get to a telephone. And I was definitely using the type that she could also put in her apron and carry around with her.
Different phones with different numbers, it just occurs to me.
Well, and unfortunately, yes, but you have call forwarding, you see. So I could make sure everything was call forwarded into one phone, and that was helpful.
That's a really good example. And while having your morning cup of coffee may sound to someone like it's not that important, it's so significant for your independence and maintaining your lifestyle and doing the things that you want to continue doing for as long as you possibly can. But we've not mentioned medications, visits to doctors, a number of other things that require more care, can be more of a crisis, can make it very difficult for someone who has a full-time job who's now confronted with caring for a family member that needs a lot more support than they needed a week ago or even a month ago. So these are very significant issues for families.
And a little pill managing container can only go so far.
Yeah, there's a lot of limitations.
And there are so many things like that, right? We think about the breadth of that from whether it's a cup of coffee or in cognitive terms, it could be as simple as brushing your teeth. You think of how many
Your
steps
first act of the day is autonomous, and that's important to people, isn't it?
Very
and
important.
all of those things that make up your day. But then you look at medication management, transportation, looking at social, all those things that are about quality of life and how we engage with others. When people are living at home, and as we see these pieces come up, or as caregivers, how do we do all of that? If somebody's able to drive or not, how do we access the places and people and the things they want to be able to see, being able to attend church or temple, all of those things come in that often we don't think of, but they are what make us who we are, how we engage, how we interact, and all of those things come along in different ways for a caregiver and the people they're caring for.
Including the simple act of bathing. I mean, obviously, fortunately, I was able to get a property, and mother could be in that property, and we had a very low step-in shower because there was no way in the world the caregiver could have gotten her in and out of a tub. So oftentimes, those adjustments have to be made just with the physical property itself. But, and sometimes it can be very expensive. So it's difficult for folks that don't have the wherewithal to be able to do that.
It can be expensive to overhaul your bathroom and have that ideal 2-inch step-over.
Absolutely, yes.
And you're often doing it when you absolutely need to, right? That's part of it too. As things progress, you're realizing something happens and you need to make an adjustment.
It's an emergency and
So
you have to deal with
in
it.
that condensed time. So it's not only those barriers, but it's also then being able to do it versus what are some of the really important conversations to talk about what's ahead, what could you plan for, what could you be looking at? All of this kind of comes into play.
Well, as far as our discussion is concerned, the plot thickens, you might say, when you consider day-to-day support can be hard for family members because they have their own lives and their own responsibilities too. So that adds up to pressure and maybe things getting overlooked and not done.
Well, that's exactly right, and that's why there are some interventions that can take place. We have the adult day services, for example. If an individual truly cannot be left alone for any number of hours, really, adult day services is available, and in many cases, an individual can qualify under Medicaid through the federal government, combination state government funding, or if they're not that poor, which is one of the bad requirements of Medicaid, then they might be able to qualify under the state's option options program, which is very similar to the types of services that Medicaid would provide, but it's funded by the Pennsylvania Lottery. And it's on a sliding fee scale, so depending upon the individual's ability to pay for services, that options program can help. So there are these kinds of interventions that can take place in addition to home care. That's also, which is what I utilized when I was out of town, but and there's a lot of home care agencies out there, although they too are suffering since COVID because they're having a tough time getting people who are willing to go into somebody else's house.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we have to remember is that there's not a one-size-fits-all. Mm-hmm. As we age, just as when we were younger, we want to do our own thing. Our families look differently. Each individual has a support system. Some can adjust quickly and pivot when there's a crisis. Some cannot. Most of the people I talk to, again, I talk to people in the supermarket. I talk to people that I run into at events with AARP and with Clay and with Roy. We work together. We run into people. Most of the people I talk to do not qualify for Medicaid. It is a low-income program. Mm-hmm. So the cost then falls back on the family or the individual, and that can be very challenging. I will also say, though, that I really want to give a plug for adult day centers. Before the pandemic, we saw adult day centers as an alternative to people who go to work, someone comes for their loved one who's experienced some cognitive issues, mm-hmm. And they're in a safe place all day, and then they have them home in the evenings with
Nora,
family and loved one.
how are they distributed statewide? In other words, everybody, our listeners, our viewers want to know if one's nearby.
There may be one nearby. There were more before the pandemic. The pandemic was a big hit for adult day centers. Many of them have come back. Check with your local area agency on aging. We'll give the number at the end of the program, I'm sure. Look in your town, look in your county. There are adult day centers across Pennsylvania and really across the country. It's a good alternative for some people.
Right. There's about 200 of them in Pennsylvania right now that are up and functioning. Mm-hmm. There's also the LIFE program, which has essentially adult day centers of its own, or it contracts with existing adult day centers. So if anyone is involved in the LIFE program, that's one avenue also. But as Nora said, the best thing to do is to check with the area agency on aging. There's 52 of them across the Commonwealth. Every county is represented by one of them, and they will have the information to be able to forward for not just adult day, but any other number of helpers as well. Mm-hmm.
Now, Medicaid's already been mentioned a couple times so far, and I'm going to return to that subject along with Medicare. But first, I just want to talk about our general attitudes and how people's attitudes evolve over time as far as the way we view giving day-to-day support to older Pennsylvanians. And what kind of change or evolution have you seen over recent years that is just helping?
Well, first I'm going to tell you what's not helping.
Go ahead.
And that is the demographic boom in this population. People are living longer. They want to age at home. We need care and services and innovations and supports to help them do that. Mm-hmm. And by helping that individual do that, we're helping families, we're helping loved ones, we're helping communities. Everyone benefits when someone can stay at home for as long as possible and enjoy that connectivity mm-hmm. with their family and friends.
Right.
So I think that's a really important thing to note here. We're here today in part because the population is growing every day, and it's a huge, huge issue for many, many families.
And what Nora has just described, what we call today home and community-based services. When the lottery was established in 1971, and as you know, Larry, I know this because I helped write the bill. That's an indicator of how long I've been around. But when the lottery was established, it was designed for that very purpose, mm-hmm. to be able to allow people to remain in their home and live in the community for as long as possible and avoid having to go into an institutional setting. And nowhere in the lottery, however, will you find that there is a statement saying this is for home and community-based services, because we didn't use that term at that time. So that's one of the things that has clearly changed as people have begun to recognize that there's a whole array of services that are necessary for an individual to be able to access from time to time if necessary, or perhaps all the time, to be able to stay in their home and community. Mm-hmm. But the governments, both the federal and state government, have moved in the direction of recognizing that as well, mm-hmm. and have encouraged all the various players in this to begin to focus upon deinstitutionalization, if you will, before it ever occurs. In other words, let's keep people at home and in the community because it's a lot less expensive. It's where they want to be. It keeps them, frankly, healthier for a longer period of time than if we just default automatically. And that is the one issue with Medicare. You have an automatic default to a nursing home, but you don't have a default to home and community-based services.
And you mentioned, you framed the question as we talk about perspective. I think as we think of the Alzheimer's Association and those living with dementia, all of those things are particularly true, but it's not only on perception, but it's reality. Right? 70% of those living with dementia are living at home. And so they have complex needs and things occurring that family caregivers and home community-based services need to be able to address. And yet often those who haven't dealt with it directly think of it as the later stages of the disease, the institutionalized care portion of it. But that is not the reality. And even today, more people are being diagnosed younger and earlier. And so it's not only how are we ready for what's here right now, but the years to come. And so your point on not only have we come a long way, but I think we're even going to see more as our aging population shifts in the coming decades.
That's what I'm looking for, is indications of progress and awareness that these things are happening.
Well, I think we're seeing innovations. We talk about smart homes. We talk about homes that are you're able to live in them from birth till death. So the universal design aspects of those homes really enable people of all ages to live together. And that's going to make it easier for family caregivers. Many of us live in older houses where we have steps up, and that can become a crisis. And the crisis, as we know, is not predictable, so families might not be ready to deal with that. But as we look at advances, that is making communities more livable, which we see in the Aging Our Way Pennsylvania plan, I think we're really becoming more sensitive to that and to supporting families as they become family caregivers.
Science has done a wonderful job, medical science has done a wonderful job of being able to address physical issues and extend life in that fashion. But they haven't found a way to be able to address mental issues and cognitive issues. And that's where we're getting this strong tension. People are living a lot longer. And as Clay knows, when you get into dementia and so forth, and you look at the 80-year-old and above bracket, you've got a lot more people affected by dementia and cognitive issues than below that. So what's the fastest growing demographic among those who are aging? Right up there close to the 100-year mark, which means we've got this tension that we really have to figure out how to deal with.
And I think there are some exciting things that are happening. One of the examples is you mentioned that kind of changing need piece. That strikes me as actually something. There are about 24 providers who've just received in Pennsylvania federal funding, really looking at something called the GUIDE model, which is dementia care navigation. So things we've talked about around physical therapy, occupational therapy, home assessments, but even social work support and nursing support to navigate the various stages of the disease and progression. We're seeing these things where it's this public-private partnership just start to come into play. But they are the ways on how do we solve for, how do we allow for these solutions to really empower families to do what they need, how they need, where they live. And so those are some of the things that I think are exciting to me that a decade ago would have been, we hope, we wish, and now you're seeing some of that come into play. It is how quickly can we bring those things to the families who are asking for them.
We started off our program talking about addressing basic needs for older Pennsylvanians, and it just occurred to me the other day, a very basic need is access to your own home. If it was built 100 years ago and it has 5 steps leading up to the front door, I saw a fairly complex ramp system made out of aluminum that made it possible for someone to get in that home. Now, someone had to engineer that, build it, and someone had to pay for it. I wonder if there are funds available that can help make those modifications.
Well, yes, there are, actually. And again, much of that comes from the lottery. And it runs through the area agencies on aging. They do have authority to do home modifications. Unfortunately, when money gets tight, and we'll talk about that later, as it has become this year, that is one of the things that has to get onto a waiting list. Because it's obviously necessary, and it's very helpful to individuals, but it's not as critical as having a home health aide or something of that nature that for the very personal care that you would need. So, but yes, those monies are available. There's federal monies available for that as well. And in fact, a number of of local counties throughout Pennsylvania have begun to look at the possibility of how they can help with home modifications too. And truthfully, it's one of the things that's the easiest thing to do in some ways and the most difficult in others. The front door of a building is generally large enough for someone in a wheelchair to be able to get in. But once you're inside that room, especially the older row homes, the doorways aren't necessarily wide enough, including the doorway to the bathroom, which is integral, obviously. So there's a lot of changes that would have to be made in some of the older buildings that are frankly very expensive and difficult, but there are some interventions that can be made as well.
I'd like to talk about the SHARP program. I work with the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging, one of our area agencies on aging in the city of Philadelphia. The SHARP program is a federally funded program, Senior Housing Assistance Repair Program. I will tell you there's a wait list for services, but they can do home repairs up to $2,500. And that's a program that exists across Pennsylvania, run by our area agencies on aging. Getting that support when you need it to get that access ramp to the front door can open a world of possibilities. Now, it's not going to help someone if they're in a wheelchair in their house and they can't get up and down the stairs. But let's take this problem as it occurs. One of the first things people need is to be able to get into their house, into that front door. And there is a program to help with that if you can't afford it. And it is not a hugely expensive repair compared to others. So I will say, let's look at each situation individually. Let's see where the solutions may exist. There's not going to be a solution for everything everywhere, but there are solutions out there right now. And I've seen them work, and it's amazing what you can do.
So let's consider to explore solutions. That's a good word. And we're considering day-to-day care for older Pennsylvanians. So bearing that in mind, we have to talk about the government entitlements. We've mentioned Medicaid a few times, but I want to take a step back from that and even just consider Medicare. Medicare government entitlement when you turn 65, and brief review on which health care expenses does that pay for, and how about these day-to-day services for older Pennsylvanians that we're concentrating on today?
Well, I will tell you that Medicare does not pay for institutional care. Medicaid is the program. It's a federally and
how about
state
treatment
funded.
at home?
It
Will
can
Medicare help
pay
you
for
out there?
some. It will help you for some of those treatments at home. But if you're talking long-term and chronic, you're not going to be able to turn to Medicare for help in that area. You're going to have to find other resources unless you're very low income and you qualify for Medicaid. So we need to have other services available. That's why.
So Medicare is there, but albeit for a limited time.
Medicare's there for a lot of things. Medicare's there for preventative care. Medicare's there for hospital care. Medicare can be there for medications. They're really important. They're one of the things we think that is keeping people living longer is the great advances we've made in medications. You know, 100 years ago, we didn't have a pill for high blood pressure. We take it for granted now. And it's keeping people alive longer and having a high quality of life. But Medicare is not going to be a solution when we have low and moderate income looking for help in caregiving.
They won't pay for that person to come over to your house.
No. It's that simple.
Our viewers need to understand that, certainly. Okay, well then why don't we get more into Medicaid, and then there's the economics considered there. And Roy, why don't you take that, because like you said, sometimes frustration results when you're above that threshold for Medicaid.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And Medicaid is based upon two things, but most importantly, it's based upon the financial assets of the individual. It's designed for those individuals who just simply don't have sufficient financial assets to do any kind of private care or get into any, or they don't have insurance, private sector insurance, or whatever the case may be. The second thing it looks at, of course, is the acuity of the situation. Does the individual qualify on both counts? Do they absolutely need the help, and are they so poor that they can't afford it any other way? There are people who are able to qualify for both Medicare and Medicaid, because Medicare, as we just mentioned, pays for things like hospital stays, it pays for doctor's visits, it pays for medication, it pays for 100 days of rehabilitation, but not any more than that. So if you need long-term care beyond that, well, now where do we go? And then that's when Medicaid kicks in. If, in fact, you need to have institutional care, whether it's in a nursing home or longer than 100 days in a rehab facility, Medicaid can pick up at that point as well. And here's what oftentimes happens to individuals. If they're not sufficiently poor, if they have too much in the way of financial assets to qualify for Medicaid, they have to what is called spend down. In other words, spend their own savings, whatever they may have, until their financial assets reach that point where they qualify for Medicaid. So by not allowing to have the ability to at least buy into Medicaid, if nothing else, which has been proposed from time to time, we're forcing people to become poverty-ridden before we're willing to give them the help they need. And what does that mean? Along that whole path, you can bet that they're getting sicker, not healthier.
So do you think a change is in order then as far as the eligibility parameters are concerned for Medicaid, Nora?
Of course, we'd love to see a change. We'd love to see more people eligible for Medicaid. We'd love to see those income limits increased. I think it's a hard sell, though, in these days where we'd have to then call on more federal and state dollars. What I'd like to do also, though, is look at what we have in place. What do we have in place in the community for people that may not be income restricted? Let's think about our senior centers, our community centers. Think about the activities that we already have that engage people in their community that can keep them healthier longer. Many of those programs are funded with PennCare, with state dollars, with local dollars, through our area agencies on aging. They are the ones that run senior centers in our communities, and they serve meals, they engage people, and we know that loneliness and a lack of connectivity is almost as bad for you as smoking. So let's just look at that to prevent people from getting to the point where they get very ill and they need more care. Let's see if we can extend that time where people are healthy, where they're actively engaged in the community. And that's really what we're about here today. That's what our area agencies on aging focus on doing, in addition to serving very low-income vulnerable individuals. And that's what the Aging Our Way PA is about. Extending the productive life that we have in our communities so that we don't need these
This would be
services.
the governor's agenda for aging Pennsylvanians, right?
Yes, absolutely. Governor Shapiro has really pushed this agenda. We in the aging
Anything
world...
manifest lately? Any tangible evidence that we're going ahead with that agenda? Who can update? Oh, I bet there's an Alzheimer's office being talked about, right?
So there is certainly a subset of that, and I think it's an exciting thing, right, to have what was an appropriation of $1.9 million to establish this Office of Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. It is a space where the governor and legislative champions have stepped in to make that possible, really to bring Pennsylvania up to speed to our counterparts throughout the country on here is dedicated staffing that's looking at policy issues and support services and really coordinating for this incredibly large population with complex issues. As we look at that right now, as we see that having moved through the budget, it is then how does that manifest? How does that engage with the area agencies on aging? The enabling legislation that includes things like the state plan and the stakeholder group and actually identifying priorities each year is still in process. But it is that initial investment that the governor, the Secretary of Aging, and others have stepped in to say, this is a space we need to do more for because we know Pennsylvanians need it and deserve it at this point. And so it's certainly exciting to see.
Well, Clay, I'd like you to keep the floor for a couple more minutes on the subject of Alzheimer's disease in general. In other words, I'd like to start with what developments have been made in the recent past that help us understand Alzheimer's disease better?
So I think it's exciting, and Pennsylvanians in particular should be incredibly proud because so much of what we've learned recently has its foundation in Pennsylvanian institutions. When you think of things like the imaging techniques used to look at the disease, they were initially developed at places like the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Pennsylvania.
So now Alzheimer's shows up on a picture, and it didn't used to.
It does. So, and not only that, but multiple biomarkers. So we're entering a world where in research settings, we can look at functional PET imaging. We can look at things like cerebrospinal fluid and diagnose accurately. But we're also on the cusp of things like blood biomarkers, being able to, in a blood test, actually be able to diagnose Alzheimer's disease and identify even
I guess
pre-symptomatic.
some tests are less invasive than others, is what I'm gathering.
There are, and you look at cost and accessibility and all of those other things to think of the difference between a lumbar puncture, a spinal tap to diagnose versus a blood test as a part of a regular panel, and identifying before you see symptoms potentially. We also see, just in the past few years, the first FDA-approved treatments ever for the actual
what's the latest on treatments? This is exciting to hear about.
It is. So there are 3 FDA-approved treatments that showed benefit in clinical trials around actually reversing amyloid accumulation, essentially the protein buildup in the brain. And
Not just slowing progression, but reversing it?
Really, they're approved for the earliest stages of the disease, and what they showed in those trials is keeping the disease from progressing. So not a reversal, not a cure, but if administered early,
the sooner you get
keeping
to it, the
people
better.
from, which then brings into things like how are we diagnosis? How are we talking about this? How are we then supporting folks? To Nora's point earlier, it also looks at how medical science has allowed us to live longer and live quality lives longer. I mean, that's the era of treatment is something we're entering to. They're the first, right? So we will hope to see continued better options, more accessible options across other dementia. But it is something that, again, a decade ago would have been pie in the sky. It would have been a wish. And so much of that work is happening here in Pennsylvania as well across our institutions, that really those who are involved in trials are leading globally and have access to things that you wouldn't be able to elsewhere in the country.
And I think education is so important here, building on what Clay said. People historically thought, I don't want to know if we have dementia. Don't tell me. It's such a terrible diagnosis.
That goes to changing attitudes.
It does.
We were
And
talking about before.
Here's something, and the earlier you get in with some of the medication, the better chance you have at maintaining without getting
So you
to
should
the end.
embrace that early diagnosis and not try to avoid it.
Well, I think you should, and right now education is the key.
Yeah.
And that's why having an office now within the Department of Aging
Yes.
in Pennsylvania, I think can make a real difference.
And how do we educate the public and the sector as well, physicians and other, because these systems piece matter, right? So if you're in a world where you can diagnose at the primary care setting with a blood, there are treatments, but to see a specialist could be a 9 to 12 month wait. You know, all of this complexity comes into play. And then once you do, it is to the point earlier, right? We do the best we can at the moment we can. All of this work is how do we reach people earlier, help them know what to navigate, being able to access things like the Areas and Aging to know what resources and services are available. That idea of aging our way, a plan on how we age, just in this short conversation, you see the complexity of all of these issues or other disease states or all of these pieces. And being intentional about that just has so much benefit to the Commonwealth, but ultimately to the individuals impacted and our aging population overall.
Clay, you said the new Alzheimer's office is still in the stage where they're establishing their priorities. So what's been built up so far? In other words, is there leadership? Is there a clear agenda? And of course, most importantly, the funding.
So I think key is the funding. We're seeing those pieces. I know they're looking at what those roles would be, how
What
they
is
would
the name of this
to
office,
recruit.
by the way? Our viewers need to know that. Anybody know the exact name of this Alzheimer's office within government?
So I think the closest we've seen, right, it is under the Department of Aging and Office of Alzheimer's Disease and Related Disorders.
Correct.
We're seeing what those
So if
roles
we go on
would
that
be.
website, we might find
If you
mention
go
of
to the
it.
Pennsylvania Department of Aging, you'll see mention of it.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's really being built out now. I think one of the pieces, and Roy and others have been active in this piece, is that there is legislation that is enabling this work, setting standards, putting in some additional accountability, and kind of where we are in our legislative session, some of these things are happening at parallel pathways. And that's one of the interesting pieces here. So it is really around how we do some of that. And how do we do it that is looking at, this is not solely an aging issue, it's a public health crisis, right, across this work. And
Some
so how are we
diagnoses
addressing?
are coming in earlier than they used to.
Certainly, certainly. And issues like brain health and risk reduction, all of that is
How
part
young?
of this
40s
conversation.
maybe?
I think I've seen early onset Alzheimer's as young as in the 50s. But we're also seeing a lot of information coming out about brain health and how to protect your brain in the long run. So sometimes it's diet, sometimes it's exercise. It's all the same things everybody says about everything, I think, in some ways. But it's keeping active. And again, I'm going to go back to social connectivity. One of the things we see is that people who engage more, who have more friends, and it's not just a numbers game, but who are socially engaged more, are less likely to have some of the mental health issues that we see. And cognitive decline can be connected with it. I think we're seeing a bit of that.
Absolutely. And in fact, in this November, the Department of Aging is hosting a forum on brain health, because we know that things like social activity, mental activity, diet and exercise outside of pharmaceuticals are the greatest things we can do to reduce our impact, to build that kind of neuroplasticity and capacity in the
Exercise
brain.
is good for the brain.
It is
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It is absolutely. So it's exciting, and that's Pennsylvania will have a forum to do that actually just coming up in a couple of months here, which is exciting as well.
Yes, and in addition, as Nora and Clay have mentioned, the change of attitudes, and you too, Larry, brought this up, the change of attitudes is phenomenal because right now, Alzheimer's, brain health, et cetera, is in a position where cancer was about 40 years ago. No one wanted to talk about it. Everybody was afraid of it. What's early diagnosis? Well, I can tell you as a cancer survivor, early diagnosis is everything. Because I was diagnosed in 2001 and had the operation, and everything has been fine since then. Without that early diagnosis, I may not be around today. We're learning the very same thing is now true about Alzheimer's and dementia, that the earlier, as everyone has just said, that you can talk about it, that you're willing to talk about it and get a diagnosis, the better off everybody is.
Clay, one more question about Alzheimer's disease in general. And often Alzheimer's disease and dementia, those terms are interchanged. I want to know, what is the difference?
So it's a great question, I think particularly important because as medical science has improved, those variations are. So dementia is a big umbrella term. We see symptoms. In fact, it's a syndrome. We see personality changes, memory changes, or other components. There are things that may manifest that way, like Roy mentioned earlier, like hearing difficulties or visual impairment, but then there are also medical issues. But again, dementia is that big umbrella. Alzheimer's disease tends to be the most common, but even as we learn more, we know things like vascular dementia or Lewy bodies dementia are increasing too. Ultimately, we're seeing some of the same symptoms, but what's happening in the brain is different. And as we get to a world of treatment and accurate diagnosis in those pieces, it would be the same 40 years ago of saying all cancer is the same cancer. That's not the case. How we approach it, what it impacts is different. And so that dementia umbrella term, Alzheimer's disease is the most common. But then even as we talk about Alzheimer's treatments, it is just treatment for a cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's disease. So there are all of these other things that we're progressing and trying to approach so that personalized medicine approach. In a community setting, the care issues are very much the same. And so that is important for us to address those issues holistically for people to live at home. The symptoms may be different, but the same challenges exist for the whole population dealing with cognitive issues.
I think it's also important to recognize that even though the implementing legislation is still awaiting passage, the legislature has clearly bought into this. The $1.9 billion appropriation has been made. There is language in the fiscal code which specifically instructs the Department of Aging to establish this office, and as soon as possible. There are 4 departments that are engaged in a cooperative effort to do that. It's the Department of Aging, Department of Human Services, the Department of Labor, interestingly enough, and the Department of Health. So there's a true effort to be able to get behind this, already approved by the legislature. The just final piece has to be done, either Senate Bill 840 or House Bill 2400, to create the ability of having the advisory committee and a few of the other things that are required in order to make this whole thing work.
So when those things are finalized, Roy, you think this will really take off? Is it holding it back in any way now? Didn't occur to me that you still had to do some legislative dotting of I's and crossing of T's.
Oh, yes. I don't know that that's holding it back because there's a lot of preparatory work that needs to be done that can be done with the knowledge that the legislation is going to be passed. Which bill it is doesn't really matter in that at all. And we have every indication that when the legislature comes back into session this month and again in October, that one of those 2 bills will be passed and sent to the governor for a signature. So I don't think it's holding it back at this point, with the exception of being able to organize the advisory committee and appoint those individuals. And by the way, that's quite a large committee.
It is.
There's at least 28 people just by my rough count earlier this morning.
And the exciting thing too is Pennsylvania is at a point where you can learn, and I think the administration has done a wonderful job looking at other states and other populations who've had some of these pieces in play, and how do you learn so that you can move this from idea to practice
That's
quicker.
not always the case. We're looking at other states, huh?
There's a pathway. Yeah, there's a pathway. We've seen places like Georgia. South Carolina is a great example where these dementia care navigators working with their aging. So right in your backyard, you're able to navigate care, but it came out of this type of state plan and this
Learning
this
from
type
other
of
people's
council.
experience. I like the sound of that.
It's an exciting thing, and I think it's something that really the Secretary and the administration have done a great job really looking at those so that we can move this to impact and benefit Pennsylvanians as quickly as possible.
Roy, let's go back to you and just consider your basic background and the kind of work you do now. Like under your name, we put the Afflerbach Group. So what is that?
The Afflerbach group is basically a consultancy group, although we do some direct lobbying as well. We represent the area agencies on aging, P4A, their organization, and individually some of the area agencies. We represent adult day centers, senior centers, the Southwestern Pennsylvania Partnership for Aging, Meals on Wheels, and at the national level we also represent National Adult Day Services. The reason we brought all these groups together into this one umbrella is because they all have not just similar interests, but also similar stake in making sure that whatever we do in terms of trying to address aging issues, we do it in the right fashion, and we do it as a collaborative more so than as a competitive business. And believe me, sometimes, I've been involved in turf battles all my life. When I was in the legislature, I chaired the Professional Licensure Committee. Now, if you want to talk about turf battles, get in there. But the fact is that they don't have to be turf battles because there are cooperative ways in which these groups can work together, and they do. And they do. We've been able to get that done. We were disappointed, very disappointed in the legislature and the governor's office this year with the respect to the budget and the fact that a number of things were held flatlined at last year's level, despite inflation, despite the fact that the AARP funds, as they're called, the American Rescue Plan Act, are going away.
Do they directly affect the area agencies on aging?
It absolutely directly affects the area agencies on aging. Across this Commonwealth, every one of those 52 agencies, which means every one of the 67 counties, is going to be trying to operate on less money this year than they did last year. Despite the fact that the number of individuals requiring assistance is increasing, the number of applications for assistance is increasing, it's just unfathomable to me how the legislature could ignore that. And it wasn't a great amount of money that the department was seeking in addition to what they already received. It was a 5% increase, $15.2 million, to be able to support these programs put out by the area agencies on aging. We are working with legislators now to be able to effectuate a transfer from the lottery funds, because remember, these are all lottery funds funding PennCare. The only other funds coming into PennCare and the Department of Aging that are not lottery are federal funds. There are no state tax dollars funding either the department, the operation of the department, or any of the programs. So we have the lottery fund. There's enough balance in there. The estimates I've most lately received is about a $200 million balance will occur at the end of the year. There's plenty of money there to take $15.2 million and give these AAAs the ability to carry on above and beyond what they had to live with last year.
So that's a matter of moving the money from the lottery to the Department of Aging?
Correct. That is it. It's as simple as that. Authorizing the governor to make a transfer from the lottery fund directly to the Department of Aging PennCare line item.
And why delay doing that? And I bet with your insight as a lawmaker, you can give us a hint.
Well, there are a number of things. There are some people that don't want to admit they made a mistake by not putting it in the first place. There are some people who are still concerned that the lottery is going bankrupt, which it never has, I wouldn't say never will, that's a long time. But clearly there's no indication that that's going to happen. There are some people who just don't understand the situation. And I mean literally just don't understand the situation, not through any fault of their own, because it wasn't explained to them. The budget
Lawmakers are expected to be experts on everything, but they're not, right?
That's exactly right. And they especially can't be if the Senate, which has done now for a few years, doesn't hold an appropriations hearing for the Department of Aging. The House does, to their credit. The Senate gave up that idea, 10 years ago perhaps, on the idea that, well, since it's not state tax money, it's off budget, so to speak, and therefore we don't have to hold a public hearing on it. Well, that's just garbage. And we've been working with Senate leadership to try to get them to understand that and come back to at least an appropriations hearing. But then you also have something which is known as a tracking document. And again, the House and the governor's budget office do this, and that tracking document lists every expenditure that is proposed in the budget by department, by line item, and how much the governor is proposing for it. Well, guess what? There's no tracking document for the Department of Aging. So when the members go into their various meetings to discuss the budget and so on, they see a tracking document for the entire general fund, which is state tax money and federal money, and they see some reference to the federal money that will go to the Department of Aging, but they don't see a tracking document for the Department of Aging and how the money is used within that department. That's got to change as well. So we're advocating that in addition to a piece of legislation to authorize the governor for a transfer. If we can get that done in the few session days, and there's only 11 session days left, for the House and Senate combined, if we can get that done in this period of time, the potential difficulty will be, well, not potential, the absolute difficulty will be abated. But if it's not done until next spring, that's a difficult situation because already the cuts and the waiting lists and so on will have been established.
That is such an expert analysis. I don't think I could add anything to it, but I will. And that is waiting lists.
Yes.
What will area agencies on aging do with this shortfall in funding that they expected up until the very last minute? There will be waiting lists for services, whether it's Meals on Wheels, whether it's an options program, whether it's senior centers, which we mentioned earlier as sort of the last bastion of activity in the community that's not means tested, and that exists in almost every community across Pennsylvania. So there are real consequences to this.
Simply put,
oversight,
waiting
shall we
lists
say.
can get longer
They will get longer.
as a result
They
of this
will
year's
get
budget
longer. That's
and
absolutely-
priorities.
That's right, Larry.
Nora, while you're talking, I want to make sure we talk a little bit about AARP of Pennsylvania. And of course, yeah, you were
favorite
hoping I'd
topic.
get to that. So you're here representing AARP of Pennsylvania. And tell us briefly what your involvement is.
My involvement is as a volunteer state president. So those of you know
They
that
already have a state president, right? Why do they need a volunteer one?
they don't have a state president, they have a state director.
Thank you.
So that state director is a staffer. And there is an AARP office in every state across the country, many in our legislative capitals. My job as a volunteer state director, I'm a lawyer by training, so I really see it as my pro bono obligation to work in the community, to work on these issues that I've gotten paid for so many years in various levels of government, and that is focusing on the aging population and making sure as it grows, it has what it needs to flourish. It can be different things for different people, but at AARP, what we're really focused on is education, is engagement, is making sure people know how to vote, where to vote, issues that really are bread and butter issues for our population, aside from the issues we've talked about today. And caregiving is a big issue for us right now. We're making sure that we talk to every candidate about their stand on caregiving. Where do they stand on this issue? How can they help people who and family caregivers who are really in a crunch and in a crisis right now, many of them. So those are just some of the issues that we're working on at AARP Pennsylvania. We have 2.8 million members across the state.
Now, Roy gave us a report on legislative progress, pretty comprehensive on funding there and how it's affecting the area agencies on aging. So let's consider then, we'll go back to something we talked about before, the governor's plan called Aging Our Way. Just so our viewers, we keep them on the tracks here, what's happening with the budget immediately? It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with his agenda for aging, does it?
No, I think it does. I think that Aging Our Way Pennsylvania is a framework, if you will, that the Department of Aging and others across government and partners across Pennsylvania have been working on. It grows out of a lot of activities related to livable communities, which is something that the World Health Organization talked about 20 years ago. So it looks at your community and gives you ways to evaluate how livable it is. And it's really about living at home, living in your community as long as possible. One of the items to come out of that is the office, the Alzheimer's office.
Right.
I'm going to call it a shorthand. And that was funded, and we're very excited about that. We think it's a huge opportunity for Pennsylvania. But there are other things in Aging Our Way Pennsylvania that still need to be funded, but it's a long-term plan. It's something that we want to go back to. We want to work with it. We want to tweak it. Each year, we want to look at the issues that we're facing. Where is there most growth in the population? Where is there more need? How has the dementia played out in our office with these new developments you just heard we're talking about today? So we're keeping our eye on that. And so Aging Our Way Pennsylvania is really about looking at those issues and looking at the Area Agency on Aging network and everything we have in place to keep people at home and in their communities longer and making sure it flourishes. And that's the overarching goal that Governor Shapiro has stated, that our Secretary of Aging, Jason Kavulich, has talked about. And that's really why we're here today, to talk to you about these issues.
And Aging Our Way PA didn't just come out of the think tanks somewhere around the country or what have you. In Pennsylvania, the area agencies on aging came together and held over 200 forums, if you will, for individuals to come in and tell the officials who were sitting there, here's what we need, here's what we think should be done.
You could call them public hearings, right?
Call it public
That's right.
hearings, that's exactly right. And so over 200 of them. There were thousands of comments that came out of those hearings, as well as others that were sent in by email or what have you. So this plan was really developed and devised out of all these people's thoughts and the desires of what they felt were necessary and how it should be done. The governor then, the governor and the Secretary of Aging asked for an $11.9 million million appropriation in the budget to be able to begin implementing all these different sections of the plan. The legislature thought that was too much of a bite at one time, and it would take time to gear up and ramp up and so forth. And so they approved, I believe it was $2.9 million, basically, which is designed for caregiver support. Now, that's clearly helpful and clearly necessary, and it gives the department a starting base from which to begin. And I think they're in the process of doing that right now. But you can see there was a huge difference between an 11.9 million request and a 2.9 million or 2.5, whatever it was in that range, for that just one piece of it. What's going to happen with the rest of it? The new budget that is proposed in February may give us an indication of that. But at this point, as Nora said, it's a long-term process, and it's supposed to be a dynamic living process. So hopefully we'll keep working through it.
Let's consider a law that's been in place since 1965 called the Older Americans Act. So let's try to put our discussion, let's dovetail our discussion today with whatever that provides as far as entitling rights and benefits for older Pennsylvanians.
It's extremely important because there's a funding from the Older Americans Act comes directly into the area agencies on aging, and one of the principal requirements for the Older Americans Act.
And it sounds like federal funding, right?
It is federal funding. That's exactly right. One of the principal requirements is that there be at least one area agency of aging in every state. Well, a state like Pennsylvania needs more than one. Rhode Island's perfectly gotten a well done with only one, but their entire land base is less than the county of Allegheny in Pennsylvania. So the states vary in the numbers that they have. But the most important aspect of that is nutrition and meals. It's expanded beyond that for other services, but it was really that which got started with the Older Americans Act back in 1965, I believe. And that became the hallmark of the act, if you will, because the various candidates for president in 1960 and 1964 going around the United States were just appalled at the amount of people that simply did not have sufficient meals and sufficient food. So the idea of congregate meals and setting up a senior center, again, a mandatory portion of the act, is there for that purpose. Home delivered meals has been added to it, a number of other things as well. We're very concerned right now because the act expires this year, at the end of this month, actually, and Washington has failed to renew it.
How often do you have to renew it, Roy?
Every 5 years is what they've been doing. I don't know that there's a requirement that it be every 5 years, but they've chosen to do it in every 5-year increments. And it expires, as I say, this year. I believe it's September 30th. Congress has been very slow in terms of getting anything together to renew it. The Senate has been moving pretty deliberately to do so. The House hasn't even been talking about it at this point.
Any tweaks expected to the Older Americans Act?
Well,
I mean, since you renew it every 5 years, it's tempting to take a good look at it and update it.
That's right. And I think there will be some tweaks added to it. But the real problem lies in the House, where we have members who absolutely just want to do away with it. They feel that it's outlived its usefulness. And they are basically the ones that are
Is it maybe redundant with some other funding source? What's their reason?
Well, their reason, I suspect, is they want to cut back on the budget. There really isn't any good reason that's been put forth, but it is what has been holding up consideration in the House of Representatives in Washington. That's going to pass. Once this election is over in November, I am sure that the act will be taken up, probably not until next year when all the new members of Congress are sworn in. But I don't see it going away by any means, and I do see some tweaks taking place to modernize it, if you will, and to address some issues that have been of a concern for some time, because 5 years ago, we didn't have the type of virtual and electronic communication that we have today, so some of those things have to be updated. But yeah, it's an extremely important act.
We have about 5 minutes left in our program, so let's circle around to daily caregiving here. And certainly our viewers are out there, and they have questions. So what should they do right now if they encounter some of these problems with older parents who obviously need some help at home? What can they do to tap into available funds out there? That's the key.
Well, I think they should start with their area agency on aging. And let me just say that in Philadelphia, it's called the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging. In Montgomery County, it may be called something else. In Allegheny County and Pittsburgh, it may be called something else. So I'm going to just suggest Google Area Agency on Aging in your locale.
Sounds good.
I mean, we can give you the, I think it's P4A, P4A.org. Pennsylvania Association of Area Agencies on Aging. Who's going to remember that? It's a lot of A's, but if we start somewhere looking for aging services where you live, get to the Area Agency on Aging. They have an information and helpline. It is a really important place to start. Now, You may be disappointed if you don't qualify for services, but there are services in the community that you can pay for. And if you can't afford those services, there are some services, senior center, some Meals on Wheels, do not look at financial eligibility. So you may be able to take advantage of some of those services.
You have to explore all these possibilities.
You have to explore it. It's challenging. Don't give up. Keep trying. But Google Area Agency on Aging in your location.
And if you, excuse me, Clay.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Clay,
I
please.
think one of the things, it's just an add-on to that, because AARP and the Alzheimer's Association also have a site, communityresourcefinder.org.
That's true.
Which not only on your local area agency on aging, but if there are other questions you have, other resources, support services, and other pieces. So we have those, but I think that's a great example of, with your zip code, getting that targeted information right in your backyard.
Right.
It's really local. What you want to find out to stay at home and stay in your community is, what does your community offer to support you?
Right.
Now, there are many websites you can look at. It's a great idea to mention AARP, of course, and their resources, and the Alzheimer's Association, and P4A. So those are just a couple.
People
of
have to
them.
know that these programs are out there. Sometimes
right.
you can feel isolated,
Exactly.
but
Absolutely.
you got to reach out.
Right.
Absolutely.
And if you don't have access to, for whatever reason, to websites and computers and
That's
so
a good
on,
point.
pick up the telephone.
That's a good point.
Either you or your neighbor probably has a telephone. Pick up the telephone. I can assure you, if you call any legislator's office, whether in the House or the Senate, they will be able to direct you to your local area agency on aging, as will your county commissioners, your county executive, your mayor, in many cases, in the municipalities. They all have these directories that will be able to say, oh, area agency on aging or aging services, to which they can direct you.
All right, our guests have been Clay Jacobs, Executive Director of the Alzheimer's Association of Greater Pennsylvania, Roy Afflerbach, Founder and President of the Afflerbach Group, and Nora Dowd Eisenhower, Volunteer State President of the AARP of Pennsylvania. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for Focus on Aging Adults. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.
Focus on Aging Adults is sponsored in part by AARP.